Hi, my name is Mabel Rosenheck. I'm an instructor here at the Bryn Mawr Film Institute, and I'm also a public historian and independent scholar. The film I chose for this week is High Noon. High Noon is a Western that was released in 1952, stars Gary Cooper as Marshall Kane, and it also features Grace Kelly and Katie Jurado, among others. The director is Fred Zinman, and the writer is Carl Foreman. We can read this film somewhat differently depending on who we emphasize as the author. For some, Zinman may be compelling because he's familiar from other films like From Here to Eternity, A Man for All Seasons, and many others. I'm going to focus more in this introduction on the writer Carl Foreman, the context of the early 1950s, and the circumstances under which Foreman wrote the film. The plot is that Marshall Kane is retiring, and as he's doing so, he learns that a man he once arrested is now getting out of jail. So he turns to leave, gets a few miles out of town, and then decides it's his duty to come back to town and make sure Miller doesn't cause trouble. So in some ways, this is a pretty conventional or familiar Western. It's the good guy versus the bad guy, and the good guy's going to do what's right. But it becomes really a character study, both of Kane himself and then also of the town. Kane goes around looking for people to help him, looking for deputies, but no one in town will. They tell him to leave town. They tell him not to worry about it. They say that even if Kane is doing what's right, they don't want violence in their town because they want investors to come in and invest in the town. By the end, Cooper doesn't leave. There's a shootout, and he wins. So unless you're sensitive to genre conventions of the Western, which people in the 50s would have been, and many of you probably are as well, this might not seem that crazy. It's the good guy or the bad guy versus the bad guy, and the good guy wins. But knowing some of the conventions of the heroes and the civilization themes in the Western, and also living in the Cold War 1950s, the understanding of this film could well have been different. For Carl Foreman, the writer, the idea of standing up to the bad guy when no one else will was an allegory for standing up to Joseph McCarthy and the House Un-American Activities Committee. Foreman himself wrote the film while under subpoena from HUAC, and he was blacklisted later. For Foreman, the idea of the town that won't help is about complicity with McCarthyism and an organization like HUAC. But more broadly, it's also about conformity and the political apathy that Foreman and others saw in the 1950s. The idea was that with the shift to the suburbs and the standardization of everything, people were now all the same. No one cared about anything but dishwashers and televisions, and no one stood for anything either. The townspeople and the suburban conformists were people who wouldn't stand up for the rights of their fellow citizens. So in the film, the townspeople say, this ain't our job to stand up for justice. But Gary Cooper wonders, if it's not their job, then whose is it? And he says, if no one will take it on, then I guess I'll have to. And he's scared. He even cries. But he's tired of being shoved, is what he said. It's hard to imagine Gary Cooper being shoved, right? But he's scared. Again, he cries. So he fights back, and he wins. But then he still leaves town. Instead of the usual Western where the rough and tumble hero joins civilization in the end, he's redeemed by civilization. Cooper wants no part of that. He thinks civilization is unredeemable. So I chose this film because I like movies whose allegories might be opaque to viewers now, but whose messages would have been really unmistakable in context. In cultural studies, which is the sort of branch of film studies that my degree is in, we think a lot about not necessarily hidden messages, but parallels and allegories that reveal how cinematic narratives reflect their historical moments, even when they don't mention them. And this film is a really good example of that. But it's also a really good example of how a film can be just as relevant for a new era, one that ends up having the same problems. When I selected this, I didn't anticipate how powerful a message it would be for us in the year 2020. This film is about standing up for justice in the face of complacency and apathy. There's a lot going on in the world right now, and I think this film reminds us that this is a time to make decisions about what's right and to fight for them. So while you're watching, I urge you to think about the state of civil society in the 1950s when this film was made, but also the state of civil society today. Are we the townspeople? Who are our Gary Coopers? And what do we do after the gunfight is over? Thank you, and I hope you'll join us for our discussion next week.